Lindsay Parker was the epitome of sophistication and power in her city. Her presence was always noticed, whether at the most exclusive events or in business meetings. Known for her sharp intellect and impeccable taste, Lindsay had secured a prominent position that few would dare to question. But behind the flawless image, there was a woman marked by deep pain. Tragedy struck her life when Clara, her older sister and confidant, unexpectedly passed away, leaving an unbearable void and an 8-year-old boy behind. Ethan, a boy with a shy gaze and delicate mannerisms, came to live under Lindsay's care. Grief turned into an overwhelming responsibility, but also into a new form of love she had never experienced before. Ethan was more than just a nephew. He was the link that kept her connected to Clara's memory, and he quickly became the light that brightened Lindsay's darkest days. Then Jake Harrison entered her life. He had the kind of charisma that could open any door and the ambition of someone who accepted nothing less than absolute success. Jake and Lindsay met at a charity event where the sparkle of the lights seemed to be eclipsed by the energy between them. The connection was instant, as if fate had placed them in each other's paths. Over time, their relationship deepened, and Lindsay's days became filled with a passionate love. Months later, during a night under the stars in a carefully planned setting, Jake held Lindsay's hands, his eyes locked on hers. "Lindsay, I want to spend the rest of my life with you," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Marry me." Lindsay's heart raced. The moment she had longed for had finally arrived. But before she could give her answer, Jake gently squeezed her hands and, with a serious tone that instantly changed the atmosphere, added, "But there's a condition. I can't continue if that boy remains in our lives." Lindsay's expression froze. Her hands, warm from Jake's touch moments before, began to tremble involuntarily. Confusion and shock overwhelmed her mind. "You're asking me to choose between you and Ethan?" Her voice came out almost as a whisper as the gravity of the situation began to set in. "Yes," Jake replied without hesitation, his gaze steady. "It's either me or that freak. I'm not raising a child that isn't mine." Lindsay felt torn in opposite directions, as if her heart was caught in a trap. On one side was Jake, the man who seemed like he had stepped out of a dream. He was the promise of a passionate life, filled with ambition and shared accomplishments. The kind of partner she had always envisioned by her side, someone who could offer the stability and love she so deeply desired. But on the other side was Ethan, little sweet Ethan, who was all that remained of Clara, her beloved sister. He was the living link to the past, the last thread keeping Clara's memories alive and vibrant within Lindsay. Lindsay's nights began to stretch into silent torment. Lying in bed, her eyes fixed on the dark ceiling, she found herself immersed in incessant thoughts. Every possibility seemed to bring a different kind of pain. If she chose Jake, she would have to abandon Ethan, a thought that made her feel as if she were betraying her own sister. But if she chose to stay with Ethan, she would lose Jake and everything he represented. The thought of losing the man she loved felt like a knife lodged in her chest. Meanwhile, Ethan remained unaware of the tension that filled the house. He continued to be the adorable, innocent boy he had always been. His laughter, his little antics, and even the way he held Lindsay's hand while they walked in the park all contributed to strengthening the love she felt for him. Each time he smiled at her, it was as if an electric current surged through her heart, making the decision she had to make even more painful. Jake, on the other hand, began to sense Lindsay's hesitation. His eyes, once so confident, now looked at her with a mix of frustration and impatience. One evening, as they sat in the living room, he finally broke the silence. "Lindsay, we need to talk about this," he said, his voice firm but tinged with an urgency that didn't go unnoticed. Lindsay took a deep breath, trying to conceal the turmoil consuming her. "Jake, this is so difficult for me." Jake moved closer, taking her hands in his. "If you love me, you'll know what to do. We can have our own children, Lindsay, but I can't share you with anyone. I can't accept someone else between us." Jake's words echoed in Lindsay's mind, each one a new stab in her already wounded heart. She looked at him, her eyes brimming with tears that she struggled to hold back. "Jake, I need more time." "There's no more time," he replied, his voice low and determined. "I can't keep going like this, waiting for you to choose. I need to know, Lindsay. Do you love me, or do you love your sister's memory more?" After weeks of uncertainty, Lindsay found herself face to face with the reality she had feared the most. Jake, with a determined look and a voice laden with frustration, cornered her with a statement that sounded like a final verdict. "Lindsay, either you choose me now, or I'll walk away forever." Those words echoed in her mind, like a clock counting down to the end of everything she knew. The deadline was fast approaching, bringing with it the despair of a choice that seemed impossible. Each passing day was another step towards the abyss of guilt and desperation. Jake was everything she had ever wanted in a man, promising, passionate, and ready to build a life by her side. But the thought of losing Ethan, the boy who had become the center of her life, felt like tearing out a piece of herself. In the weeks following Jake's ultimatum, Lindsay withdrew into her own world. She spent hours staring out the window, watching the street below without really seeing anything. The nights were sleepless, marked by silent tears and thoughts that repeated like an endless cycle. There was no easy answer, and time was running out. Ethan, on the other hand, began to notice the change in the woman he saw as a mother. His aunt, once so attentive and present, now seemed distant, lost in thoughts he couldn't understand. "Aunt Lindsay, are you okay?" he would ask, his voice filled with childish concern as he tugged on her coat sleeve to get her attention. Lindsay, struggling to hide the internal storm, tried to smile. "I'm fine, my love. I'm just a little tired." But the smile she offered was forced, and Ethan could sense that something was wrong, even if he didn't fully understand what it was. The days passed, and the weight of the decision pressed down on Lindsay more and more. She knew she had to choose, but whichever choice she made, she would lose something precious. On a particularly quiet night, while Ethan slept in the room next door, Lindsay sat in the living room, her eyes fixed on the wall where photos of Clara and Ethan were hanging. "What do I do, Clara?" she murmured into the emptiness, her voice breaking with anguish. The image of Jake appeared in her mind, and she felt a pang in her chest. What would life be like without him? But then, Ethan's laughter echoed in her memory, and the pain intensified. Jake, realizing that the deadline he had set was nearing, confronted her again. "Lindsay, I need an answer. I can't keep waiting while you decide. It's not fair to me." She took a deep breath, her eyes filled with a sadness he hadn't seen before. "Jake, I don't know what to do. I can't imagine my life without you, but I also can't abandon Ethan. He's a part of me." Jake sighed, his frustration spilling over. "Lindsay, this isn't a life. We can't keep going like this. I need to know, now. Do you choose me, or do you choose him?" Lindsay walked through the house with an unbearable weight on her shoulders. Each step seemed to sink her deeper into the decision she had made. After endless nights of torment, she chose to pick Jake, believing it was the only way to preserve the relationship she valued so much. The choice, however, was far from a victory. It was a desperate act, an attempt to hold on to something she knew could slip through her fingers. Sitting at the kitchen table, where she and Ethan had so often shared laughter and meals, Lindsay waited for him to return from school. Each second of waiting was torture, time stretching as if toying with her anguish. When Ethan finally walked through the door, with his backpack slung over his shoulder and his face lit up by the innocent smile that had always given her strength, Lindsay felt her stomach twist. She knew that this moment would be forever etched in her memory. "Ethan, come here, sweetheart," she called softly, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. Ethan, unsuspecting of what was to come, dropped his backpack on the floor and ran to her, his eyes shining with curiosity. "Yes, Aunt Lindsay," he replied, climbing into the chair beside her, his small body radiating the confidence of someone who felt loved and protected. Lindsay took a deep breath, fighting against the tears that threatened to fall. "Ethan, I need to talk to you about something very important," she began, choosing her words with the care of someone walking on broken glass. "You know how much I love you, don't you?" Ethan nodded, his large, round eyes fixed on hers. "I know, Aunt Lindsay. I love you too." The knot in Lindsay's throat tightened even more, but she knew she had to continue. "That's why I want what's best for you. I want you to have everything you need to be happy, to grow strong and healthy." She paused, gathering the courage for what she had to say next. "And that's why I've decided that you're going to live with a new family, a family that's going to take very good care of you." Ethan's smile vanished instantly, replaced by an expression of confusion and fear. "What? I'm leaving? Where to?" Lindsay tried to keep her voice steady, but she felt that each word was like a stab in her own heart. You're going to be with a family that will give you everything you need, Ethan. They're going to love you and take care of you. Tears began to form in Ethan's eyes, his voice trembling as he asked the question Lindsay feared most. You don't love me anymore, Aunt Lindsay? Those words hit Lindsay like a blow, the pain in her chest becoming almost unbearable. But she knew she had to keep her composure, for Ethan's sake. I love you, Ethan, with all my heart. And that's exactly why I'm doing this. I want you to have a good life, full of love and opportunities. I have to do what's best for you. Ethan couldn't understand. The confusion in his eyes mixed with a deep sadness that tore at Lindsay's heart. But I'm happy here with you. Why do I have to leave? On the day Ethan was taken to his new foster home, Lindsay's house felt enveloped in an oppressive silence. Every corner, every object seemed to recall the boy's presence, and his absence weighed like a shadow she couldn't shake off. Watching the foster family's car disappear around the corner, Lindsay felt an emptiness so profound it seemed to tear a part of her soul away. It was as if, in that moment, the world around her had stopped, and all that remained was a silent, unbearable pain. Jake, on the other hand, didn't hide his satisfaction. To him, Lindsay's decision represented the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. He embraced Lindsay with enthusiasm, his eyes shining with excitement. Now, we can finally move on, he said, his voice filled with hope. We can live like a normal couple, without complications. Lindsay tried to respond with a smile, but the effort was in vain. Every word from Jake, though well-intentioned, seemed like a distant echo amidst the whirlwind of emotions consuming her. She wanted to believe she was doing the right thing, that choosing Jake would bring the happiness she so desperately sought, but the void left by Ethan was overwhelming. The nights that were once filled with children's laughter and bedtime stories were now marked by deafening silence. The house, once alive with Ethan's energy, now felt empty and cold. Lindsay found herself wandering through the rooms, as if searching for something she knew she would never find. Every forgotten toy, every drawing he left behind, was a painful reminder of what she had lost. Regret began to seep into her thoughts, taking hold of her moments of solitude. The doubts she had tried to suppress began to surface, questioning whether she had made an irreparable mistake. The image of Ethan, his eyes full of tears as he asked if she still loved him, wouldn't leave her mind. The words she had spoken, in an attempt to convince herself she was doing the right thing, now sounded hollow and meaningless. Lindsay felt trapped in a cycle of sadness and regret that only seemed to intensify with time. The bed, which once felt welcoming, was now a place where she lay without finding rest. She tossed and turned through the night, sleep eluding her with every haunting thought. What was once a home now felt like a prison of painful memories, where each recollection of Ethan was a cruel reminder of the choice she had made. Jake began to notice the changes in Lindsay shortly after Ethan's departure. The vibrant and confident woman he had fallen in love with seemed to have vanished, replaced by a pale and distant version of herself. She no longer smiled as she once did, and the eyes that used to shine with joy and determination now appeared empty, lifeless. Even when they were together, Jake felt as if there was an invisible barrier between them, a distance he didn't know how to bridge. Determined to bring her back, Jake tried everything. He surprised her with expensive gifts, like sparkling jewelry and designer dresses, which would have once made her smile from ear to ear. He planned luxurious trips to exotic destinations, believing that perhaps a change of scenery could help her forget what was left behind. But despite his efforts, nothing seemed to work. Lindsay accepted the gifts with a forced smile, and during the trips, she remained silent, contemplating the emptiness around her as if trapped in her own thoughts. One night, after yet another failed attempt to lift her spirits, Jake finally decided to confront what was right in front of him, but which he had been avoiding. He found Lindsay sitting alone in the living room, staring at a photograph of Ethan she had taken weeks before he left. Her face was bathed in the soft light of the lamp, and tears silently streamed down her cheeks. "Lindsay," Jake began, his voice heavy with concern and guilt. "I asked you to choose between me and him, but I think it broke you. I don't know what else to do to make you happy. Maybe I was wrong to force you to make that choice." Lindsay lifted her eyes to him, and Jake saw the deep pain reflected in her gaze. Her words came out low, broken by sobs she could no longer hold back. "Jake, I should never have chosen you. Ethan was everything to me." The confession hit Jake like a blow, and he felt the weight of her words crushing down on him. Lindsay, I thought I was doing what was best for us. Best for us? Lindsay interrupted, her voice choked with emotion. I sent away the only piece of my sister I had left. I traded him for a promise of happiness that I now see could never be complete without him. Jake remained silent, realizing that all his attempts to fix what was broken had only deepened the wound. Lindsay. I wanted so badly for us to be happy. But now I realize that I can't be happy like this, she replied, tears falling freely, the pain etched into every word. Ethan was my family, Jake. And I lost him, because of you, because of me. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive myself for that. With her heart in pieces and an unbearable weight on her chest, Lindsay made the decision she had been postponing for days. She knew she couldn't continue her life without Ethan, the boy who had become the center of her world. Regret burned in her veins, and the longing was a constant pain, a cruel reminder of her choice. One night, while sitting on the bed, unable to close her eyes, Lindsay turned to Jake, who was sitting beside her in silence, lost in his own thoughts. Jake, I need to find Ethan, she said, her voice weak but full of determination. I can't go on like this. He's a part of me, and I want him back. Jake looked at Lindsay, seeing the raw pain in her eyes, a pain he knew he could never alleviate. He sighed, rubbing his face, clearly worn out by everything that had happened. Lindsay, if this is what you need, then I'll help you. I can't stand seeing you suffer like this. Lindsay felt a momentary relief at those words, as if, for the first time in weeks, a small spark of hope had been ignited. Thank you, Jake. I know I made a mistake, but I need to fix it. I need to bring him back. The two began a frantic search for Ethan, a desperate effort that consumed every moment of their day. Jake used all his connections, hired private investigators, and made calls to anyone who might offer a lead. Lindsay, in turn, scoured photos and documents, trying to remember any detail that could help find the boy's whereabouts. But things weren't as simple as they had hoped. The adoptive family, who had promised Lindsay they would take good care of Ethan, had moved to another city, leaving little information about the new address. Every lead they followed seemed to evaporate before them, leading to dead ends and disconnected phones. Lindsay, who had initially been driven by a desperate energy, began to feel the weight of failure. Each day that passed without news of Ethan was torture. Jake, what if we don't find him? She asked one night as they reviewed yet another list of leads that led nowhere. Jake, sensing the anguish in Lindsay's voice, tried to stay calm. We'll find him, Lindsay. We won't give up. He's out there somewhere, and we'll bring him back. But Lindsay's desperation only grew with each failed attempt. She couldn't sleep, and the nights turned into long vigils of anxiety. I should have followed my heart from the start, she murmured to herself, staring out the window, her eyes fixed on the horizon as if waiting for Ethan to appear at any moment. Jake tried to comfort her, but he knew words were not enough. Lindsay's pain was palpable, and with every new dead end, he watched the woman he loved crumble even more. The emptiness that Ethan had left in their lives seemed to grow with each passing day, and the possibility that they might never find him became a thought too impossible to ignore. During the intense search for Ethan, Lindsay began to come across disturbing information about Jake. While investigating the boy's whereabouts, she uncovered details she had never imagined, revealing a dark side to the man she was about to marry. Enigmatic comments from former business partners and unclear financial documents began to surface, suggesting that Jake might be involved in questionable activities. One afternoon, while sifting through papers and messages she had found in an old office of Jake's, Lindsay came across a series of financial transactions that made no sense. The content of these documents raised suspicions about shady dealings and financial agreements that were not exactly clean. With each new discovery, her heart filled with a growing mix of shock and despair. Lindsay decided to confront Jake, determined to understand what was happening. When he came home that night, she was waiting in the living room, the papers spread out on the table in front of her. Jake immediately sensed the seriousness of the situation. Lindsay, what's going on? Jake asked, trying to read the expression on her face. You seem worried. Jake, Lindsay began, her voice trembling with emotion. I found things I can't ignore. These documents and the comments I've heard about you, they suggest you were involved in shady dealings. Jake turned pale at the sight of the papers on the table. He tried to stay calm, but his voice betrayed a hint of nervousness. What are you implying, Lindsay? These are just rumors, things without foundation. I've always done the best for us. Lindsay was not convinced. I don't believe in coincidences. The way you insisted that I choose between you and Ethan seemed more than just jealousy. Now, I'm starting to think there might be darker reasons behind it. Jake tried to avert his gaze, but Lindsay was not willing to let it pass. Why did you want Ethan gone so badly? What were you hiding from me? I need to know the truth. Jake took a deep breath, trying to come up with a convincing answer. Lindsay, you have to understand. I just wanted us to start a new life together, without the complications Ethan brought. It's nothing more than that. Lindsay listened to Jake's words and sensed the lack of sincerity in his voice. The trust she had in him was crumbling, replaced by a growing unease. Jake, I can't continue like this. I feel like I'm being deceived, and it's destroying everything we've built. The silence that followed was heavy, and Jake, facing the intensity of the accusation, found himself cornered. Lindsay felt the weight of the truth slowly revealing itself, and the fear that Jake's intentions were more sinister than she had imagined began to erode her hope. During the search for Ethan, Lindsay began to come across information that cast new light on Jake. What initially seemed like just concern for Ethan's safety and well-being revealed something much deeper and more sinister. As she sifted through old documents and spoke with contacts who had information about Jake, she uncovered a startling reality. Jake was buried in massive debts and involved with very dangerous people. The signs were clear. Jake had accumulated an enormous debt with individuals who had no patience for negotiations. Messages and call records showed veiled threats and persistent demands for payment. Even more alarming was the fact that he had tried to use his relationship with Lindsay as a financial lifeline. Jake's strategy was now obvious. By getting involved with Lindsay, who came from a wealthy family, he hoped to solve his financial problems and secure a safe future. And Ethan, Lindsay's potential heir, was seen by Jake as an obstacle to his plans. Lindsay was in shock as she saw the details of these revelations. Sitting in front of the computer, her face pale and her eyes wide, she felt choked by the revelation. The feeling of betrayal was overwhelming, and despair enveloped her like a heavy cloak. The truth about Jake was painful and shocking, a revelation that tore apart the trust and love she believed she had. In a moment of brutal clarity, Lindsay realized that her relationship with Jake had never been what it seemed. It was a carefully constructed facade to deceive her, a trick to achieve his own goals. The image of Jake as someone genuinely interested in her crumbled, replaced by the picture of a man who saw Ethan and her only as tools to further his own ambitions. Determined to protect Ethan at any cost, Lindsay made an irrevocable decision. She knew that to ensure the boy's safety and well-being, she needed to cut all ties with Jake immediately. The idea of staying with someone who was willing to sacrifice what was most precious to her just to solve his own problems was unthinkable. The realization that the love she thought she had was an illusion made her decision even more painful, but it was a choice that had to be made to ensure Ethan was out of reach of someone with such dark intentions. With the help of a private investigator, Lindsay had finally managed to locate Ethan. Feeling a mix of relief and the urgent need to confront the truth, she knew she had to face Jake with what she had discovered. The meeting was scheduled for the afternoon, when Jake returned home after a long day at work. Lindsay was waiting for him in the living room, the atmosphere charged with palpable tension. Jake walked through the door, trying to maintain his composure, but upon seeing Lindsay, his expression shifted to a mix of surprise and apprehension. "Lindsay, what's going on?" Jake asked, noticing the firmness in her tone. "Why the sudden meeting?" Lindsay, her heart pounding, wasted no time. "Jake, I found Ethan. He's safe now, and I'm here to tell you the truth." Jake hesitated, trying to put on a mask of genuine surprise. "What are you saying? You found Ethan? That's great." But Lindsay wasn't willing to be deceived again. "No, Jake. What I discovered goes far beyond that. I researched and found out about your debts and your involvement with dangerous people. The truth is, you were never interested in me for true love. You wanted my money, and now I see that clearly." Jake tried to defend himself, desperation evident in his eyes. "Lindsay, please, you need to understand. I was desperate. I did what I thought I had to do to survive. It wasn't just about the money, it was about securing a future for both of us." Lindsay shook her head, frustration and pain unmistakable in her voice. "No, Jake. I don't want to hear any more excuses. I gave you the chance to prove you were worthy of my trust, and you used it to manipulate me. I lost what I loved most because of your lies and deceit." Jake attempted to approach, reaching out in hopes of reconciliation, but Lindsay stepped back, the firmness in her stance clear. "It's time for you to leave my life, Jake. I need to fix the mistakes I made and ensure that Ethan is safe." The decision was made. Lindsay had no room left for doubts or compassion. The time for manipulation and deceit was over. What remained now was facing the harsh reality and starting to rebuild her life, with Ethan by her side and Jake out of it. When Lindsay found Ethan, the reunion was filled with complex emotions. Ethan was older and seemed to carry a deep sadness that was impossible to ignore. His eyes, once bright and full of life, were now dull and burdened with a weight that his age shouldn't have to bear. He was sitting in a corner of the living room of his new adoptive home, shoulders slumped and gaze lost. Lindsay entered with a heavy heart, feeling a lump in her throat at the sight of her nephew's transformation. She approached slowly, struggling to find the right words, but the pain and regret overflowed from her voice. "Ethan," she began, her voice choked, I need to apologize. I made the biggest mistake of my life by letting you go. There was no excuse for what I did, and I'm so sorry for hurting you." Ethan lifted his head slowly, his eyes meeting Lindsay's with a mix of pain and surprise. Her words seemed to touch something deep inside him. He hesitated for a moment, then, with tears beginning to slip down his cheeks, he stood up. Lindsay reached out her arms, and without needing more words, Ethan hugged her tightly. It was a hug that carried years of longing and pain, but also unwavering love. "I still love you, Aunt Lindsay," Ethan murmured, tears falling onto her neck. "Even after everything, I never stopped loving you." Lindsay held Ethan with all the strength she had, tears streaming down her own face. She felt the comforting sensation of having Ethan back, and the weight of guilt began to lift, replaced by the joy of their reunion. "I love you so much, Ethan. I will never let anything or anyone separate us again. I promise I'll do everything I can to make sure we never go through this again." The hug lasted several minutes, as they both allowed themselves to feel the relief of being together again. The warmth and comfort of each other's presence seemed to heal, even if only partially, the open wounds. Lindsay felt her life beginning to rebuild, and Ethan, though still sad, found solace in his aunt's love, promising himself and her that they were ready to face the future together, stronger and united. At the moment Lindsay finally reunited with Ethan, something completely unexpected happened. While they were still hugging, the sound of footsteps echoed through the room. Lindsay turned around, and her heart nearly stopped as she saw a man standing in the doorway. He had an aged face, eyes marked by invisible scars from a life full of secrets. Before she could react, Ethan slowly pulled away, his gaze fixed on the stranger who seemed both familiar and unfamiliar. What's happening?" Ethan asked, confusion mixed with a hint of hope. "Who are you?" The man stepped forward, his eyes locked on Ethan. "It's me, Ethan. I'm your father." The words hit Lindsay like an electric shock. "How is this possible?" You can't be," her voice faltered as she tried to comprehend what was happening. Since Lindsay's sister had died, everyone had believed Ethan's father was also dead, a victim of the tragic circumstances surrounding the family. "My death was faked," the man explained, his voice deep and filled with regret. "I was forced to disappear to protect myself and Ethan. There were threats, dangerous people who wanted to reach me, and the only way to keep him safe was to make everyone believe I was dead." Ethan stared at the man in front of him, a mix of emotions dancing in his eyes. "But, you left us. Why?" Ethan's father sighed deeply, as if carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "I had no choice, son. There was no other way. But now, with the threats controlled, I've returned. I've come back for you." Lindsay could barely process the words she was hearing. How could this be true? Everything she had believed was suddenly in question. But what struck her the most was the revelation that came next. "Jake knew," said Ethan's father, his eyes fixed on Lindsay. "He knew everything from the beginning. I went to him to protect you and Ethan, but he used that information for his own purposes. He manipulated you, made everything seem different from what it was. The room seemed to spin around Lindsay. Every piece of the puzzle began to fall into place, and what emerged was a picture that left her feeling disgusted and betrayed. Jake had lied, deceived, and manipulated everyone around him, using the return of Ethan's father as a weapon for his own interests. Lindsay turned to Ethan, holding his hand firmly. She could feel the turmoil of emotions inside him, but she knew they needed to stay strong. "We're in this together, Ethan," she whispered, determined. "Now that we know the truth, we'll face it together. I promise I won't let anything hurt you again." Ethan squeezed her hand, finding comfort in his aunt's presence, even amid the confusion. They were ready for whatever came next, prepared to face the consequences of the lies and manipulations that had nearly destroyed their lives. With the truth finally exposed, the future seemed uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Lindsay felt she had the strength needed to protect what mattered most, Ethan. So, did you enjoy Lindsay and Ethan's story? Leave a comment below. We make a point to read each one. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel to stay updated with all the emotional stories we produce for you. Your engagement helps us grow our channel more and more. Now, we're leaving you with an emotional story to warm your heart. Thank you for being with us. See you in the next video.